There is something nobody tells you about the people who seem unshakable, the ones who move through difficulty without collapsing, who receive criticism without crumbling, who experience loss, betrayal, rejection, and somehow remain recognizably themselves on the other side of it. Most people look at those individuals and assume they feel less, that they have built something, a wall, an armor, a particular hardness that prevents the pain from arriving, that the secret to being unshakable is finding a way to stop being touched. But Carl Jung spent decades studying the human psyche at its deepest levels, and what he found was the opposite of what most people assume. The people who are genuinely unshakable are not the ones who feel less. They are the ones who have gone further into what they feel than most people are willing to go. They are not protected by distance from their inner world. They are protected by an intimacy with it so thorough that nothing from the outside can introduce them to something they have not already met in themselves. This is not a comfortable idea, because it means the path to becoming someone nothing can break does not lead away from pain. It leads directly through it. And most people, when they encounter that truth, turn back. They choose the armor instead, the performance of strength instead of the development of it, the carefully maintained image of someone who is fine instead of the difficult, unglamorous work of actually becoming fine. This video is about what happens when you stop turning back. When you stay with what is uncomfortable long enough for it to show you what it actually contains. When you stop trying to protect yourself from your inner world and begin, perhaps for the first time, to genuinely inhabit it. Jung believed this was the most important journey a human being could undertake, not because it was pleasant, but because it was the only journey that leads somewhere real. The first thing you need to understand is why the things that hurt you have the power they do. Because most people have this completely backwards. The common assumption is that pain comes from outside, that the words someone said were sharp enough to cut, that the betrayal was significant enough to break something, that the loss was real enough to justify the collapse. And there is truth in this, of course. Words can be cruel. Betrayals are real. Loss is genuine, but Jung identified something that goes deeper than the external event itself. He observed that the intensity of pain a person experiences in response to something external is almost never proportional simply to the external thing. It is proportional to where that thing lands inside them, what it activates, what it touches, what old wound it finds and presses against. Think about this from your own experience. You have probably noticed that the same kind of comment, the same dismissiveness, the same criticism, the same form of rejection, can affect two different people in completely different ways. One person hears it and feels a sting, acknowledges it, and moves on. Another person hears it and is devastated for days. The external event was identical. The internal response was completely different. Jung's explanation for this was not that one person is stronger than the other. It was that the second person has an unhealed wound in exactly the place the comment landed. And an unhealed wound does not need much pressure to produce significant pain. It is already sensitive. It is already waiting. And when something from the outside touches it, even lightly, even unintentionally, the pain that erupts is not just from the present moment. It is from every moment that wound has been carried without being truly addressed. This is the brutal truth Jung was pointing toward. The reason certain things hurt you so deeply is not that those things are extraordinarily powerful. It is that they are finding something inside you that has never been healed. And until that something is genuinely addressed, not suppressed, not managed, not covered with the performance of strength, it will continue to be found. By different people, in different circumstances, in different forms, but always arriving at the same wound, because the wound is what is drawing them there. Most people, when they realize this, do one of two things. The first response is blame. If the pain is coming from an internal wound, then the wound must be someone's fault. The person who created it, the circumstances that caused it, the past that produced it. And there is often genuine truth in this attribution. Wounds do not appear from nowhere. They are created by real experiences, by real failures of care, by genuine cruelty, by actual abandonment or betrayal or neglect. The wound is not imaginary. The pain is not fabricated. But Jung understood that remaining in the position of attributing the wound entirely to its origin, however justified that attribution might be, keeps a person locked in a specific kind of helplessness. Because if the wound belongs entirely to whoever created it, then healing it requires something from them, requires their acknowledgement, their apology, their change. And most of the time, that acknowledgement never comes. The person who hurt you has moved on, or they do not believe they did anything wrong, or they are no longer present in your life, or they are simply not capable of offering what would be needed. And so the person waiting for external resolution to an internal wound waits indefinitely. The wound remains open, and every new experience that touches it confirms that the world is the problem, that other people are the source of the pain, that the appropriate response is better protection from the outside. The second response, and this is where most people end up, is armoring. If the wound cannot be healed by external resolution, then the next best thing seems to be ensuring nothing can reach it again. Build walls high enough, become indifferent enough, develop the performance of not caring thoroughly enough that even you begin to believe it. And then for a while, this works. The armor does keep certain things out. But Jung identified what it also keeps out: everything else. The capacity to be genuinely moved by beauty, by connection, by the ordinary moments of being alive that require a degree of openness to be felt at all. The armor that protects from pain also protects from everything that makes being alive worth the difficulty. And the person inside the armor, however safe they feel, is not living. They are surviving, which is not the same thing. Jung introduced a concept that most people encounter once and think they understand, but that reveals its full depth only through genuine personal confrontation. He called it the shadow. The shadow is not, as many people assume, simply the dark or evil parts of a person. It is more precise and more personal than that. The shadow is the collection of everything a person has separated from their conscious identity, pushed away, denied, suppressed, because at some point it felt too dangerous, too unacceptable, too threatening to the image they needed to maintain. For most people, this process begins in childhood. The child learns through 1,000 small interactions which parts of themselves are welcome and which are not. The anger that produced punishment, the neediness that produced withdrawal, the grief that was met with discomfort, the fear that was called weakness, the ambition that made others uncomfortable. One by one, the unacceptable parts are separated from the conscious self, not eliminated, separated. They go underground, into the shadow, and from underground they continue to operate, not as conscious choices but as automatic reactions, not as things the person knowingly does but as patterns that seem to happen to them. The anger that explodes disproportionately because it has been compressed for years, the anxiety that floods in without apparent cause because the genuine fear was never allowed to be felt and processed, the depression that descends because grief that was never mourned has found another way to make itself known. Jung was precise about what this means for the question of being hurt. As long as significant material remains in the shadow, unacknowledged, unexamined, unintegrated, it creates vulnerabilities that the person cannot see or defend against. Because you cannot protect a wound you do not know you have, and you cannot heal something you refuse to acknowledge exists. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be seen. Here is where the path becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because integrating the shadow, bringing into conscious awareness the parts of yourself that have been living in the dark, is not a pleasant process. It requires looking directly at things you have spent significant energy not looking at. The rage you told yourself you did not feel. The grief you decided you had finished with before it was actually complete. The fear you converted into contempt because fear felt more dangerous than anger. The neediness you buried under self-sufficiency because needing things from people had proven at some point to be unsafe. These things did not disappear when you stopped acknowledging them. They simply moved out of sight. And in moving out of sight, they moved out of your control. Because you can only work consciously with what you can see consciously. Everything else works on you without your participation. Jung wrote something that functions, when truly understood, as one of the most clarifying insights in the history of psychology. He wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Think about what this means specifically for the experience of being hurt. The pattern of finding yourself in the same kind of painful dynamic repeatedly, with different people in different contexts, but arriving at the same essential wound, is not bad luck. It is not evidence that the world is particularly cruel to you. It is the unconscious doing what the unconscious does, recreating the conditions of the unresolved wound, because the psyche, in its strange and persistent wisdom, knows that the wound needs to be addressed, and it will keep creating opportunities for that addressing to occur, until it finally happens. Or until the person dies still wondering why the same things kept finding them. There is a particular kind of suffering that Jung paid close attention to. Not the acute suffering of a specific loss or betrayal, but the chronic, low-level suffering of a person who has decided that the appropriate response to pain is to feel it as little as possible, who has organized their life around minimizing contact with their own inner world, who stays busy enough, distracted enough, social enough, productive enough that the quieter signals from within never quite get loud enough to demand attention. This person often appears, from the outside, to be functioning well. They are capable, they are often high-achieving, they have developed genuine skills for navigating the external world. But there is something missing in them that is difficult to name. A quality of genuine presence. A sense that the person you are encountering is fully there, not just performing being there, but actually inhabiting the interaction with their whole self, because the whole self requires access to the parts that have been suppressed, the vulnerability that was deemed unacceptable, the uncertainty that was converted into false confidence, the genuine emotional responses that were managed into something more presentable before they could be felt honestly. Jung believed that this suppression, however understandable its origins, however functional it appears in the short term, accumulates a debt. And the debt comes due, sometimes in physical symptoms that have no clear medical explanation, sometimes in relationships that cannot achieve the depth the person consciously wants, because depth requires the very openness they have trained themselves to avoid, sometimes in a creeping sense of meaninglessness that arrives despite the achievement of everything that was supposed to produce meaning. The suppressed material does not wait patiently. It finds channels, and the channels it finds, when conscious integration is refused, are rarely the ones a person would choose. So what does it actually mean to become someone nothing can break? Not the performance of it, not the armor, not the carefully maintained image of a person who has moved past needing anything from anyone. The real version. Jung's answer was not the one most people want to hear. It begins with the willingness to stop running from your own inner experience, to sit with what is uncomfortable rather than immediately converting it into something more manageable, to feel the anger without immediately expressing it or suppressing it, but to stay with it long enough to understand what it is actually protecting, to feel the grief without immediately deciding what you have felt enough of it, but to allow it to move through at its own pace rather than the pace that is socially acceptable or personally convenient, to feel the fear without immediately converting it into either action or denial, but to remain present with it long enough to hear what it is genuinely telling you. This is not passive. It is one of the most demanding things a person can do. Because every trained instinct, everything the nervous system learned about how to survive, pushes in the opposite direction, away from the feeling, away from the discomfort, away from the encounter with the parts of yourself that have been exiled to the shadow. But Jung was clear about what this avoidance costs. Every time you flee from your inner experience, you reinforce the unconscious pattern that produces the flight. Every time you suppress rather than integrate, you add to the accumulated material that will eventually find its own way to the surface. And every time you choose the armor over the awareness, You trade the possibility of genuine freedom for the temporary comfort of a protection that was never truly keeping you safe. There is a moment that happens to almost everyone who goes far enough into this process. A moment that is not dramatic, not sudden, not accompanied by any external signal that something significant has occurred. Oh, it arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day, or in the stillness before sleep, or in the strange clarity that sometimes follows a period of genuine difficulty. And what arrives is a recognition, not of something new, of something that was always there, that the pain you have been running from, the specific quality of suffering that has followed you through different relationships, different circumstances, different versions of your life, was never as dangerous as the running made it feel. That the wound, when you finally turn toward it rather than away from it, is not bottomless. It has a shape, a history, a reason for existing. That, when understood, changes the relationship between you and it entirely. This recognition does not eliminate the pain, but it changes what the pain means. And that change in meaning is the beginning of everything Jung believed was possible for a human being who was willing to do this work. To understand what genuine integration actually looks like, not as a concept, but as a lived experience, you need to understand what Jung meant by becoming whole, because wholeness is not the same as goodness. It is not the achievement of a self that is purely positive, consistently admirable, free from darkness or contradiction, or the capacity for things you would rather not acknowledge. Wholeness is something more honest and more demanding than that. It is the condition of a person who has stopped dividing themselves, who has stopped maintaining the fiction that the acceptable parts are the real parts and the unacceptable parts are aberrations, exceptions, things that do not truly belong to them. Every human being contains the full range of human experience, the capacity for generosity and the capacity for selfishness, the capacity for courage and the capacity for cowardice, the capacity for genuine love and the capacity for cruelty, envy, manipulation, the desire to be chosen over others, the satisfaction that can arrive against your better intentions, but when someone who diminished you fails. These capacities are not character flaws in the people who have them. They are the complete inventory of being human. And the person who has genuinely integrated them, who has looked at the full range of what they contain and said, with honesty rather than self-condemnation, "This is what I am made of," is qualitatively different from the person still engaged in the project of convincing themselves that only the acceptable parts are real, because the person who knows their own darkness is not controlled by it. They can see it operating. They can recognize the impulse before it becomes the action. They can choose differently, not from suppression, but from genuine awareness. The person who has never acknowledged their darkness has no such choice. The impulse moves through them unconsciously, finding expression in ways they do not recognize as their own. In the passive aggression they would deny if accused of it. In the subtle undermining they genuinely do not see themselves doing. In the emotional patterns they repeat while genuinely believing they are the victim of circumstances rather than a participant in a dynamic they are unconsciously co-creating. Jung was not interested in making people feel bad about their darkness. He was interested in making it conscious, because consciousness is the only thing that creates genuine choice, and genuine choice is the only thing that creates genuine freedom. Now let us talk about what this means, practically, for the experience of being hurt. Because the question this video began with, how do you become someone nothing and nobody can truly break, deserves a specific answer. Not a philosophical one, a lived one. The first shift happens when you begin to distinguish between the sensation of pain and the story you tell about what that pain means. Pain, as a raw sensation, is information. It is the psyche's signal that something significant has occurred, that something has been touched that matters, that attention is required. This is not weakness. This is the nervous system functioning exactly as it was designed to function. The problem is not the pain. The problem is what most people do with it in the first seconds after it arrives. They immediately begin constructing a story about what the pain means about them, about their worth, their lovability, their fundamental adequacy as a human being. A story about what the pain proves about other people, about their untrustworthiness, their cruelty, the impossibility of genuine connection. A story about what the pain predicts about the future, about whether safety is possible, whether anything can be different, whether the wound will ever stop being found. And it is the story, not the pain itself, that does the most lasting damage. Because the pain, if allowed to move through without being immediately converted into narrative, does what pain is designed to do. It signals, it informs, and then given space, it passes. But the story does not pass. The story gets carried, rehearsed, reinforced, built upon with each new experience that seems to confirm it, until the story becomes the lens through which everything is interpreted. And the lens becomes invisible because it has been there so long. It feels like simply the way things are. Jung's work suggests that the path to becoming unshakable runs directly through this process, not around the pain. Through it, feeling it fully enough to receive the information it carries, without immediately converting it into a story about what it means forever. There is a specific practice embedded in Jung's understanding of shadow work that most people never reach because they stop at the intellectual level of the concept. They understand, cognitively, that the shadow exists. They can describe it accurately. They can identify it in other people with considerable precision. But they have not done the thing that actually changes something. They have not sat with their own darkness long enough to stop being afraid of it. And the fear of the shadow, the fear of what you might find if you look honestly at the parts of yourself you have been managing carefully, is the single most powerful obstacle to the kind of integration Jung believed was possible. Because the fear generates avoidance, and avoidance keeps the shadow exactly where it has always been, underground, unexamined, continuing to operate from beneath the level of conscious awareness. So what does it actually mean to sit with your darkness? It means, when you notice an impulse that conflicts with your self-image, staying with it long enough to understand it, rather than immediately suppressing it. When the envy arrives, and it will arrive because you are human, and envy is part of the complete human inventory, not immediately covering it with a more acceptable response, but asking with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, what is this telling me about what I want or what I fear? When the anger surfaces at an intensity that seems disproportionate to the current situation, not immediately converting it into either explosion or suppression, but staying present with it long enough to ask, what older pain is this connected to? What does this anger know that I have been pretending not to know? When the fear arrives, especially the fear that feels too large or too formless to look at directly, not immediately filling it with activity or distraction, but sitting in it long enough to let it become specific, because formless fear is far more powerful than fear with a shape. A shapeless fear fills everything. A specific fear can be examined, understood, and sometimes resolved, or, if not resolved, at least seen clearly enough that it no longer operates from the dark. Jung believed something about suffering that most of the culture around psychological well-being actively contradicts. He believed that suffering, genuinely engaged with, rather than avoided or immediately treated as something to be eliminated, was one of the primary pathways to genuine psychological depth. Not because suffering is good, not because difficulty should be sought out or celebrated, but because the encounter with real pain, when met honestly rather than fled from, forces a kind of confrontation with the actual structure of the self that comfortable circumstances rarely produce. You learn things about yourself in genuine difficulty that you cannot learn any other way. You discover which of your values hold under pressure and which were always more aspirational than actual. You find out where your genuine resources are, not the performed confidence, not the social competence, not the capabilities that function when everything is relatively stable, but the deeper reserves that only become accessible when the surface-level resources are exhausted. And you encounter, in the specific quality of what breaks you, the most precise map available of where the unhealed material lives. Because what breaks you is always pointing at something, not at your weakness. at your wound, and wounds, unlike weaknesses, can be healed. Not quickly, not without cost, not without the genuine discomfort of allowing what has been kept underground to surface into the light, but healed, in the sense that the relationship between you and that material changes, not that the history disappears, not that the sensitivity vanishes entirely, but that the wound is no longer running your responses without your knowledge, no longer sending you into dynamics you would not consciously choose, no longer making you vulnerable to the same specific form of pain, delivered by different hands across the years of your life. The person who has genuinely done this work, who has met their shadow, integrated their wounds, made the unconscious conscious, carries themselves differently. Not with the performance of invulnerability, with something quieter and more substantial than that. A quality of being present in their own skin without apology or anxiety. A capacity to be moved by things without being destroyed by them, because being moved is not the same as being broken. The person who is genuinely whole can feel deeply, can be touched by loss, by beauty, by the ordinary moments that carry unexpected weight, can receive criticism without collapsing, because their sense of who they are is no longer dependent on external validation for its stability, can experience betrayal without it confirming a global story about the untrustworthiness of everyone, because they know themselves well enough to assess what happened with specificity rather than converting it immediately into evidence for a predetermined conclusion, can sit with uncertainty without needing to resolve it prematurely into either false hope or defensive cynicism, because uncertainty is simply what reality is. And a person who has genuinely inhabited their inner world, with its contradictions, its unresolved questions, its coexisting impulses that do not always point in the same direction, is not disturbed by complexity. They have already encountered it in themselves. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Sit with that for a moment. Not the most difficult thing. Not the most demanding thing, the most terrifying thing. Because complete self-acceptance is not the soft, comfortable thing the word acceptance sometimes implies. It is the willingness to see yourself without softening what you see, without converting your failures into lessons so quickly that the failure itself is never fully acknowledged, without maintaining the narrative of your own goodness so carefully that the moments of genuine smallness, genuine cruelty, genuine cowardice are quietly edited out, without needing yourself to be more or other than what you actually are. This is terrifying because the ego, the structure of self-concept that organizes your sense of who you are, depends for its stability on a certain degree of selective perception, on not seeing too clearly, on maintaining the image of yourself as fundamentally adequate, fundamentally good, fundamentally deserving of the things you want and the relationships you value. And complete self-acceptance threatens all of that, because it requires seeing the ways in which you are not always adequate, the ways in which you are not always good, the ways in which what you have wanted has sometimes been taken from other people rather than genuinely earned. This level of honesty is not self-punishment. It is not the cultivation of shame. It is the specific kind of clarity that Jung believed was the foundation of genuine psychological strength, because a self-concept that requires careful protection, that depends on selective perception and the management of information, is inherently fragile. Any sufficiently accurate challenge to the image threatens the entire structure, but a self-concept grounded in genuine self-knowledge, in the full and honest accounting of what you contain, without the need for that accounting to be flattering, has a completely different quality of stability. It does not need to defend itself, because it is not built on something that requires defense. It is built on what is actually there, and what is actually there, however imperfect, however contradictory, however far from the ideal, is solid, in a way that the performed self can never be. This is what Jung meant when he pointed toward a life in which nothing and nobody can truly break you. Not a life without pain, Not a life in which criticism fails to land, or loss fails to cost something real, or betrayal passes through without leaving a mark. But a life in which none of those things can dismantle you, because there is nothing in you that requires the concealment of what is real. No wound so unacknowledged that anyone with the right pressure can find it and use it. No part of yourself so exiled to the shadow that its unexpected emergence can shatter your sense of who you are. No dependency so unexamined that its disruption leaves you with nothing to stand on. The person who has done this work is not invulnerable. They are something better than invulnerable. They are genuinely present, available to the full experience of being alive, including its difficulty, including its loss, including the specific and irreducible pain of caring about things and people who are not permanent and not always safe. And they meet all of it from a center that holds, not because the center is made of anything harder than what the rest of us have access to, but because it has been built, slowly, imperfectly, through the genuine encounter with everything that was previously exiled from awareness, on something real, on the actual self, rather than the performance of one. If something in this reached a place that recognition comes from, rather than argument. If you felt, somewhere in what was said here, the shape of something you have been carrying for a long time, without quite being able to name it, leave one word in the comments that describes what you have been most afraid to look at. Not for others to see, for yourself to acknowledge, because naming it is the first act of integration, and integration is where this begins.